And we thank you so much for joining us for today's dialogue on Chinese diaspora in the modern world. This forum is organized by World Scientific Publishing and named after the journal China and the World, Ancient and Modern Silk Road, to promote communication and exchange on China and BRI-related themes. The executive directors of the China and the World Journal are also pleased to announce that the latest issue can be freely accessed by creating an account with World Scientific. Please also be welcome to submit your papers to the journal. You may visit the journal's website in the chat box for more information. Now, for a few housekeeping notes before we start, you are most welcome to keep your cameras on, but please keep your mics muted while the forum is ongoing. There will be a Q&A session after the talk, so please feel free to post your questions in the chat box at any time. After you post your question in the chat, you may be invited to unmute and to read it out during the Q&A session if you are comfortable doing so. Also, this webinar will be recorded and posted online. Today, we are very pleased to have with us our special guest, Professor Wang Gungwu. Among many other activities, he is the former director of the Research School of Pacific and Asian Studies, Vice Chancellor of the University of Hong Kong, and since 2007, he is also University Professor at the National University of Singapore. Our co-moderator is Professor Stephen Pei, Professor of Physics and Electrical and Computer Engineering at the University of Houston, Deputy Director at the Center for Advanced Materials, and Executive Director at the Southwest Public Safety Technology Center. Our moderator for this event will be Professor Darshan, Honorary Dean of Hainan University Belt and Road Research Institute and Chief Advisor of the China Silk Road I-Valley Research Institute. They will be the main speakers for the dialogue and will also reply to your questions during the Q&A session. Now, without further ado, let us warmly welcome our speakers.
Thank you, Sam. Greetings from Texas. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you are. First of all, we would like to thank Dr. Pan Guoju and World Scientific Publishing for hosting this webinar. I met Dr. Pan when I was a graduate student in the 70s, when the US and China just started its honeymoon. Half of a century later, the US-China relationship has made a 180-degree turn. We are honored today to have Professor Wang Gungwu to join us to discuss this important topic, which is particularly important to Chinese Americans, given the rising tension between the US and China. We do not know a scholar or leader more qualified than Professor Wang. He has studied and written about Chinese diaspora, but he has also objected to the use of the word diaspora. The word may be the root of some of the challenges that Chinese Americans are facing today. We would also like to thank our co-sponsors, Bridge Road International Foundation, Chaolu Jijinhui, the Historical Record of Chinese Americans, 美华史记, the US-China Perception Monitor, the Carter Center, 中美印象网, and the United Chinese American, 美国联合华人会 in the US. And last but not least, the National University of Singapore. Let's welcome Professor Wang.
My service. And then
Professor Wang?
Would you like me to speak now?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay. Well, let me begin by thanking all of you for asking me to come along to talk about this very interesting and very important subject. I must confess that I would not have accepted it if not for the persuasive style of Professor Darshan, who suggested to me that I can manage it in a form of a conversation with all of you, because frankly, the subject is so big, could be a subject of a series of lectures, and one can still find room to think about that. It is an enormous subject, and things are changing fast, so it's very difficult to keep up, and I will not try to do it this morning. What I think we agreed to was that we will have a conversation, but before we have that, I should provide a brief outline of some of the main points that I am concerned about and I consider to be very important to bear in mind when we think about this subject. These are my personal thoughts. I do not claim that they are applicable universally, but I would offer them as simply from someone who is a historian by training and who has been trying to follow this subject for a very long time. And over that period of time, things have changed a great deal, and it would be foolish for us to think that things will not change some more. So I think we are operating in a world of change, and not only change, but rapid change. And therefore, the need to be alert, the need to keep an eye on what is happening will be even greater as time goes on. But let me go back and just look at the overall problem. It seems to me that the biggest problem is, to start with, is that Chinese, the word Chinese itself, actually can be very misleading, because we forget there are many varieties of Chinese. And if you take time into account, there are many layers of Chinese. And if you look at all the other issues concerned, there are also perceptions of Chinese. Who is Chinese, as seen by the Chinese themselves, by the Chinese in China, by the Chinese outside of China in different parts of the world, and by how foreigners see China. Even in different parts of the world, people perceive the Chinese differently, and for different reasons. They have all complicated reasons, local as well as global and highly political international issues involved. So the criteria and the way people perceive Chinese vary quite considerably. That's the starting point. And among the varieties, we have to take note of the fact that the clusters of Chinese are very different. There are large clusters of them in places like Southeast Asia, where I would say the largest numbers are to be found. And they're growing clusters in North America, in Oceania, that's Australia and New Zealand, and now also in Europe and Africa, elsewhere in Asia as well. But historically, it was really Southeast Asia and East Asia to some extent where the Chinese were to be found. And because of that, a long period of time and the spread of the Chinese in every part, every corner of Southeast Asia, or what we used to call the Nanyang, that makes that particular cluster of Chinese a very special problem. It has special features to it. And although there have been relatively few new migrants into that area, they haven't really fundamentally changed the basic structure of how the Chinese have developed their lives over the centuries in that region. Whereas elsewhere, where the Chinese population has grown more recently, very different issues develop out of that. So the spatial part has to be taken into account. It's very hard to generalize about all the Chinese. It's not the same. They do vary considerably. One can go on, but I don't think we want to overdo it. But nevertheless, we mustn't neglect it. We mustn't assume that when we talk about the Chinese overseas or Chinese diaspora and so on, we are talking about one type of people, very easy to define. They're not at all easy to define. Over time, of course, we are now talking about the modern period. So I don't want to go far back into the past. But as I said, it's important to remember that when it all began, it was essentially a commercial entrepreneurship of the Chinese that led the Chinese to leave China. Traditionally, it has not been in fact, in the very nature of Chinese culture itself, the way we place a lot of attention to our ties to our family, our loyalty to our clan, our genealogy, our kinship systems, and so on. We're not expected to leave home. We're not expected to leave China. The ideal thing is to live in China, never go out. So going out is already regarded as something unusual. It's something that's venturesome and or out of necessity and so on. Both, of course, occurred quite often. So to bear that in mind, it was a big step for those early entrepreneurs to venture forth, mainly for commercial reasons. Of course, some of them would bring workers with them, but even the workers who went with them all ultimately hoped, if they had a chance to save some money and be more successful in what they did, and they would then become merchants themselves. So the commercial and economic drive for livelihood and for gaining some prosperity and raising funds which you take home to help the family, all that was fundamental to the initial push. Since then, of course, things have changed. When we talk about the modern period, let us say we take it from the late 19th century, when large numbers of Chinese began to move out of China. Prior to that, the numbers were relatively small, in fact, very, very small to begin with. But the large numbers really began in the late 19th century. So what we're talking about today, when we talk about roughly 50 million or more people of Chinese descent around the world, we're talking about people who left in the middle to late 19th century onwards. And in particular, of course, the 20th century, we have two very significant periods. A very significant period after 19th World War, because the whole global system changed. They're no longer a few major empires dominated by the West with the colonies everywhere, where in fact all the Chinese who went there, most of them had to deal with the Western imperial governments and colonial governments rather than with the native peoples. On the whole, that was the general pattern, because the world was dominated by these Western imperialist powers and their colonies. So the Chinese had to deal with those people in power. But after 1945, with decolonization and the end of the empires, we now have a growth of new nation states all over the world. And this brings up this whole concept of nation, which is something totally new to the Chinese and totally new to Asia and most of the world. In fact, it was invented in Western Europe, and now through the imperialist empires have been adopted now by others as being the ideal way of dealing with these empires. To get the empires out of our homes, we declared ourselves nations, and we set up on the task of nation building. But in this context of nation building, then the role of the place of the Chinese changed its nature quite fundamentally. You're no longer dealing with outside forces, external forces that are dominating those parts of those indigenous peoples, local peoples, but you're now dealing with local nationalists who are concerned with building their own nations. So that fundamental change affected all the Chinese everywhere. And this doesn't matter how big or small the country was. Each country thought in terms of their national interests and national security, national economic development, and so on, then the Chinese who were there had to adapt to it or leave. Either leave to go back to China or leave to go somewhere else where they can find a situation more acceptable to them. But that decision had to be made by most Chinese who were already abroad. They had to face this question of dealing with a new nation state. Now, those who went to the West, to Western colonial or national states already, like the United States and the British, part of the British Empire, like Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, they had somewhat different problems. And they were already dealing with the Westerners directly. And that relationship was different because in those cases, there were hardly any native peoples to talk about. We're talking about the Chinese having to deal with the white man, the dominant white man who set up these colonies in the first place, unlike those elsewhere. So from the very beginning, there was a very distinct relation. Chinese in the Southeast Asian people dealing with natives who were colonized by the West, and those Chinese who were dealing with the dominant Westerners who had created those colonies. So that has to be borne in mind. But after 1945, a new set of relationships among the new nations created problems which the Chinese there, particularly in the new nations, had to find ways of adapting to. And as you know, many people chose to go back to China. That was probably half the population voted with their feet, went to China or remigrated somewhere else. But the other half adapted themselves to the new nations, accepted the nationalities of these new nations, and made this conscious decision to be loyal subjects of these nations. In fact, were encouraged to do that by everybody, that they should be loyal subjects to these nations. So these changes happened after 1945. The final change was that at the end of the Cold War, when the West, in their own civil war among themselves, for ideological reasons between capitalism and communism or socialism, between that civil war, the West fought a civil war during that which the world was divided and polarized, and the Chinese themselves were caught in that. There were those Chinese who were caught on the side, as it were, siding with the Communist Party of the People's Republic of China, and those who were caught up with the nationalists, who were the remnants of which were in Taiwan. So even among the Chinese, we were caught up in part of this Cold War ideological divide. So that affected them. But after 1990s, with the end of the Cold War, the situation changed again. So this was, when you talk about the modern world today, the most modern development was at the end of the Cold War, there was no, at least for a while, no ideological divide, but the world was now being dominated by one sole superpower, the people who won the Cold War, the United States of America. And that is why, ever since then, of course, the United States of America becomes the central problem, not just to the Chinese, but to everybody in the world, because they were the sole superpower. And they had the power to impose their will upon many other countries and to take aggressive action and intervene in areas where they either disagree or they consider to be some kind of threat to their interests. So that's a larger picture in which the Chinese, of course, had a place, but a place which began to change in a way that nobody expected. And this is the key to what we're talking about today in the modern world, and that is the rise of China. I mean, in 1990s, when the Cold War ended, I don't think, at least I can't recall anybody predicting or expecting that China would be such a challenge, an economic and political challenge to the United States today, as it is today. That speed of development of China took, I think, everybody by surprise, not least the United States themselves, who were, of course, keenly interested in what was happening in China. And of course, some of them did see China as being sometime in the future, a challenge to the United States. But I think nobody expected the speed at which this was achieved by the Chinese. So the modern world that we're talking about today, if we're talking about the rise of China as a most spectacular development in the modern world, then you can see the United States and China relationship in that framework. In other words, this is a very special situation. Never before, certainly never before, not before in the 1990s, has that ever happened. I mean, if you go further back, when the Chinese were very, very powerful and the most powerful, probably most powerful in the world in their own terms, but they were not interested in doing anything elsewhere. They were primarily looking after themselves and defending themselves against their own enemies and just preserving the civilizational state that they had created. So it was a different world. It is really the post-industrial capitalist world that we're talking about today. And in that industrial capitalism that we face today, we find that the rise of China is related to that. And this is what I think makes this position so special today. That's why this modern world is so difficult to gauge today. And that is that it's no longer a straightforward ideological thing that divided the Soviet Union and the American. That was a clear thing. You can define it in ideological terms. But today, we are talking about something where the nature of capitalism itself is being challenged. The idea that all capitalism succeeds necessarily in the kind of liberal free market economy, global economy, that has been challenged by the rise of China. That the Chinese have offered a kind of capitalism where the state plays a very major role in how that capitalism develops and how it is shaped and guided. And that poses a different kind of challenge to the United States, because this is not just ideological. These people in China are capable of building an economy, a technologically superior economy one day, if it continues like this. And the challenge of the United States is just not simply an ideological, political, or even just a purely simple security challenge on military terms, but a kind of totality of developments which the rise of China can pose to the future of the United States, and of course in that way, the future of the world as the United States would see it. So when we talk about the modern world today, why we are so focused on the United States and China, I think it's pretty obvious. Now that that has happened, then the question of where the Chinese stand on this one becomes much more complicated. But still we need to differentiate between the varieties of Chinese and the different layers of Chinese participation in each of the societies and countries where they have settled. I mean, we could distinguish between those who've been there many, many generations, are totally adapted to the local conditions and have no difficulty with the new changes. They simply adapt as loyal citizens of their various states of the countries of adoption and continue to perform their roles socially, culturally, as loyal citizens and fit in without too much difficulty. But then there are others, and this is where, of course, the relative new, within the last 3 or 4 decades, there have been certainly more than 10 million new migrants who come out of the People's Republic of China itself to go to different parts of the world. Large numbers have gone to the West, to North America, Latin America, to Europe, and even to Africa. Not so much to Southeast Asia, relatively speaking. But overall, that changes the situation somewhat, because these people are very different from the past. Of course, there were still many people who were very similar with commercial and livelihood problems on their minds when they left, but many others are actually very well educated and have made conscious decisions to seek work or satisfy their professional needs abroad and make decisions to settle and work abroad. So creating a new range of professions and occupations that the Chinese never faced before. I mean, in the past, there was no such group as Chinese scientists and technologists or professionals outside of China. In Southeast Asia, they were almost all merchants and workers, fairly straightforward, and they organized themselves in a particular sort of way. Their networks were different, but networks were quite well defined, and you can identify them very easily. But today, the range of talents and people spread around the world who have come out of China makes the problem totally different. So we are now facing those challenges. I list them all. I list all these problems, not because I want to make our task more difficult, but simply to make us to remind ourselves we are talking about a changing situation. Just as I described it, over the last 100 years, how much has changed? Over the last 50 years, how much has changed? And bearing that in mind, as I said, we cannot be all that sure how it will change in the future. But certain things are fairly clear. How do the Chinese want to keep their Chineseness? You either give it up altogether, and there have been people who have given it up altogether. We have acknowledged not all Chinese have bothered about remaining Chinese. They have merged into their societies and been totally assimilated. This experience has been common in Southeast Asia. It is still possible to happen elsewhere today. That's one set. People have been there a long time. The middle set who were there since the last 100 years, they are divided and they are not very sure. Some of them have decided to settle, but on the whole, the decision to become nationals of these countries that they have chosen to settle in have also led them to accept that they are to be loyal and to serve those countries as much as possible, and at least not to do anything that will harm the country that they've adopted as their home. Now that's a dilemma which a large numbers of Chinese have experienced over the last 100 years or so, since the 1940s at least. But then, of course, the final part is what some people can summarize and call them Xinyimin. These are new migrants, and they have a new set of problems because they are not yet decided, not all of them anyway, not yet decided whether they want to settle abroad or whether they want to go back to China. And they have, in other words, some room to maneuver, choices to be made. And of course, both the country in which they work in or live in and China itself are interested in them because many of them are people with higher education, very talented people, great achievers, and of great value to society, whether to China or to the United States or elsewhere in the world. These are people with talent who are desirable people. People like them to settle and make their homes in China, wherever they are. And the Chinese also want them back. So these are now new tensions which are imposed upon those new generations of migrants, the Xinyimin. They have to make a choice. Some of them have made their choices. And some of the choices are based on economic reasons, professional reasons. Some are based on cultural reasons. They have to go back to their family at home because they cannot accept the cultural demands of the countries where they are living today. These are cultural reasons. And there are others which are political reasons. And there are elements of ideological elements in there which have not gone away, but they are originally been subordinated after the Cold War, but now re-emerging because of the political tensions between the United States and China, with both governments, one way or the other, bringing out the ideological differences that had been set aside in the course of globalization of capitalism that both sides are using very well to develop their economies. So then that creates the new set of problems, because what has happened is something that very few people expected to be so prominent as it is today, and that is nationalism itself. In many ways, in my generation, when I was young, we took nationalism for granted. New nations will naturally be nationalistic. That is, of course, and to be loyal to your own nation, to defend it against enemies, and to do what you can to make your nation rich and prosperous and stable and orderly and so on. That's part of your responsibility. And that was taken as very positive. And we have always looked at the positive side of nations. And in particular, small new nations that were facing the difficult problem of building their nations were very sensitive as to how nations should be built and how all the people within the nation should be loyal and to be helping the nation build itself into something worthwhile. And that is the focus of that nationalism. But it's still essentially positive. It is to build some modern society that will be good to its citizens and expect its citizens to serve the country well. But when the nationalism becomes also the force behind large nations, when powerful nations become nationalistic, this is a different force altogether. Because when powerful nations become nationalistic, their nationalism must be alarming to all the others. I mean, whether it's America first or China first, whichever country that is large and powerful, militarily powerful, economically powerful, politically very influential, diplomatically very dominant, when you're in that position and your people and your government takes the line that it's our country first at all costs, at other people's expense if necessary, if that attitude develops as it could develop, that makes the whole world a very dangerous place for everybody. Now, this is the kind of modern world that we're now facing. And in the case of the Chinese abroad, of course, there are very special relationships between US and China. So in particular, those Chinese who are living in the United States are in the front line of this particular problem. The rest of us are only in the sidelines. But in the front line of these problems, they have to find very, shall we say, very sensitive and subtle and at the same time, extremely intelligent ways of sorting out some of these very complex issues involved. But once you arouse people's emotions to the extent that it has been in the last few years that I've observed, both in the United States and in China, the kind of nationalism that polarizes the people to the point when it's either yes or no. There's no gray area at all. You're either for us or you're against us. When you reach that point, then it becomes extremely difficult to handle. And that, on the whole, for example, if you look at the past, in the early days, the Chinese had no interest in political affairs. They were primarily concerned with their commercial and economic interests, and took, on the whole, avoided political affairs because the political affairs were in the hands of dominant Western imperial powers. But in the nation states, they had avoided it because they didn't want to get into any kind of difficulties with the indigenous local peoples who are nationalistic about their little countries, trying to build new nations, be positive and helpful and be constructive. So these are part of the reasons why nationalism had not been such a serious problem before. But as I said, today, what we're facing for the first time in history that I know of, that is that the two most powerful in the countries in the world are also both nationalistic about one another. And the language they use and the attitudes they have towards each other, the lack of trust, which is growing distrust between not only the governments, but also the politicians, the peoples and the leaders. That kind of, that degree of national nation, my nation first, my nation right or wrong, kind of extreme positions of two powerful countries in the world is probably the most alarming development of the last few years. And for that is the background of what we're talking about today, about the Chinese diaspora in the modern world. This is the modern world that is now very unnerving, and we have to work together to find some way of diminishing the tensions and reducing the possibility of direct conflict. I think I'll leave it at that because I just want to leave you with these thoughts. I wish I had more positive and happier thoughts to share with you, but I think it is important that we are realistic about what we're looking at, what the world looks like today. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Wang. As an individual, this is Darshan Feng Darshan. As an individual, I, as an overseas Chinese, may probably hold the largest number of citizenships. I was once a British subject because I was born in India, a Malaysian citizen since Singapore for a year or so was part of Malaysia, and of course a Singapore citizen, and now an American citizen. Also deep down, I think you have already said it very succinctly. As I always tell myself, I have Chinese cultures and ways and means flowing in my blood. That means part of me is Chinese culture, the culture that nourishes my day-to-day living. So the questions of the meaning of being a citizen, whether is a citizen of China, or now a citizen of Singapore, or a citizen of the United States, could be somewhat amorphous in this categorization. At the extreme, as a global citizen, citizenship could be interpreted as a travel document. That's extreme, of course. So what is your perspective of overseas Chinese who nearly all hold non-Greater China's travel documents from mainland Taiwan, Hong Kong? What is the role of the Chinese culture that they should allow that to play in their citizenship of another country? Thank you.
That's a good question. The obvious point is that you have a choice. You had your choices. You made your choices, and you must have a good reason for making the choices you made at different times in your life. And these choices have some consequences. For you, it may mean something, one thing, but for others, it may mean different things. I understand the idea that to some it is a question of a travel passport or travel document, but to others, and this is where it comes back to this new emphasis upon national loyalties, national identification, national identities, and so on. Those who are nationalistic about their own countries and see you as a citizen of their country have different expectations of you, different from yours, and they may be in conflict. And you may have made your choice for one reason, but they may perceive you in a different light. You have chosen to be, let's say in your case, you've chosen to be an American citizen, so other American citizens may well take the view that your first loyalty must be to America and nothing else. And that's one extreme view. Of course, there are more liberal views. I mean, most countries have got the dark side and the bright side. People more liberal, people are more extreme. Every country has them. But the extreme view would be that you must be absolutely loyal to the country that you have now, that's your citizenship of. The more liberal people will say, yes, as long as you're doing no harm to the country, you want to practice your own religion, your own cultural values, you want to preserve your language, and you want to educate your children in your language, that's fine. As long as you're actually contributing to the country in some way, and you're doing no harm to the country, that's fine. See, there's many ways of interpreting. But once the extremists get the view that you have to be absolutely loyal, otherwise we can never trust you, of course, then it creates a different atmosphere. And of course, again, each country is different, but I would say every country has people like that who would expect you as a citizen of the country to be loyal to that country first and foremost. And from their point of view, the logic is obvious and it cannot be otherwise. Now that position is very common. In fact, I can think of no country in which there are not people like that. In fact, quite a lot of people like that, particularly those of new nations. I mean, ancient nations may be more relaxed about it all, but new nations are particularly sensitive about the fact that you have chosen to be our national, then your loyalty must first and foremost be to the country. So I think this is how others see you. So I think while I would understand, you see, how you might feel, and there may be others who also appreciate that. But as I said, the minimum thing is that you do no harm to the country of your adoption. The maximum is that you must be like them, totally nationalistic and devoted, dedicated to the preservation of that country and all its interests. So that is where you're faced with. So you cannot avoid the fact that whatever the country you are living in, you will meet people who would accept you for what you are and respect the fact that you would like to preserve your cultural values and be as Chinese as you like, as long as you are contributing to the country's general well-being, that's fine. But you will also meet others and who don't want to talk to you unless you speak in their language and so on. So that range, I have to say, is common to every country. And of course, in a country like the United States, it gets blown up because it's a big country and so many more people are involved. And of course, they have a different history. Their special history is something that I could go on to, but that's a different story. The United States has a very they themselves can talk about exceptionalism. There is some very exceptional bits about United States history, which is not so common elsewhere.
Thank you. The next question would come from Stephen Pei. Stephen?
Yeah, Professor Wang, let me follow up Darshan's question. Compared to him, I'm just a typical first-generation immigrant. I was born in Guilin, grew up in Taiwan, and came to US for graduate school. However, my ancestors were Arabs, and most likely they stopped by Singapore somewhere in Southeast Asia before they arrived in China. Our family can trace all the way back to Bodo-Ludian, one of the Muslim poets in the Yuan dynasty. So he took the government exam and became a Jin Shi in 1321. exactly 800 years ago. My ancestors, they accepted Chinese culture and identify themselves as Chinese. So I think to follow up what you just talked about, some people believe the tension between the US and China, not at the individual level, but in the nation level, is partially due to the cultural conflict. So the question is, what's the role of the Chinese culture in the Western world if there's a cultural conflict there? And what culture and heritage aspect can Chinese American bring to this society and this community and make some unique contribution? And the other way to go one step further, that's from another one of our sponsors, Meihua Shiji. The question was how important it is for overseas Chinese descendants, our next generation, our children, our children's children, to know the history and their ancestors in overseas. What is the significance of learning Chinese language for Chinese descendants?
Thank you for telling me about your background. You remind me of maybe you're related to Bai Chongxi and the people, other people that Bai Xianyong and that family.
We are not relatives, but we are from the same area. Yes, we are good friends.
Well, as you can see, the question of assimilation and acceptance of other people's values is not new at all. I mean, China itself is a product of centuries of assimilation of numerous tribal peoples, numerous different peoples that have become Chinese because they've accepted a particular set of values, a particular language, and accepted a particular kind of state, which the Chinese had established. And over the centuries, because it was a successful state, they've adapted to it and they've adjusted to it, while at the same time, that state has allowed those people to identify with their ancestors who came from somewhere else. It doesn't terribly matter. It doesn't matter where you came from, but if you accept those values that it is represented by the Confucian legalist state since the Qin Shi Huang unification of China for 2,000 years, if you accept those fundamental values that provide the state with its kind of prosperity and strength and so on, you are Chinese. And the word is, in fact, they don't even have a simple word for Chinese, as you know. I mean, in English, we say you use the word Chinese for everything. But in Chinese, there are so many words you can use. It depends on where you are, and who you're talking to. But so even the word Chinese itself reveals something. It's a commonality of certain traits, certain ideas of that people shared, and certain kind of acceptance of certain values and certain institutions and ideas, which we think we all should have, and is in fact the height of civilization as they understood it. I think other peoples also have that kind of trend, whether they are coming from Western Europe or coming from the Islamic world or the Indic world of South Asia, in India, with Hinduism and Buddhism. They also have their roots. They also have their way of claiming people who are different ethnic stocks, who come from different parts of the world. But if you accept a certain set of common values, you are accepted by them. There's no serious difficulty. And certainly in the Western world and in the Islamic world, where their religions are concerned, if you accept a religion, on the whole, people don't worry too much about your ethnic origins. You accept the one God and the holy book and the values that go with it, then you're part of it, and your ethnic origins become less and less important. And these are, shall we say, common features of us as human beings. We accept you because if we have enough, you and I have something in common, and we would like to emphasize our commonality and not emphasize our differences, we can get along very well. And I think that is true at every level. But of course, if you decide you want to emphasize the differences and not the commonalities for different reasons, it may be political reasons, it may be the fact that we're rivals, competitors, you are challenging my position, you are threatening my position, then I decide that I should emphasize the differences and not the commonalities. In fact, we put aside the commonalities in order to emphasize their differences so that I can justify what I say about you and what I intend to do to you. So that you see, the mind behind that, the kind of thinking behind that demonizes the opponent, make them look bad, sound bad, make everything they do sound evil and so on, so that you can justify rallying your own people to fight against them. See, that is a different set of motivations. It is not normal human behavior, but it is something that comes out of fear, alarm, anger, whatever emotion, very strong emotions involved. And as I said, many people have it. You can have it in a tribe, a family, and in a large country or a small country. But when powerful countries have it, of course, it becomes even more dangerous. In fact, whatever powerful countries do are dangerous to all the others. That's a matter of, that's a reality. So when you describe that position, how you persuade your children to be what, in the end, they have actually had to make their choices. What you wish to do, if you want to transmit those values to your children, you tell them that, frankly, this is who we are, this is what we believe in, this is what we've inherited, these are values which we think are important, and you should, and to keep them, to show respect to them, you learn the following things. You learn the language, you learn certain values, you care for the family and all the ramifications of a family system. All these things you pass on, and the nature of the cultural festivals, the customs and so on, where it is of relevant, you transmit it out of because you intend that they should appreciate it. Whether they do or not, in a way, is not in your hands. You can't force them to do that, because if they're educated in a different way, live in a different set of circumstances, and work under conditions which demand completely different kind of values and ideas, they may not find it particularly useful or interesting to pursue it. And that is beyond your control, and it is not in your hands, as it were. Just as you have made your choices that may have nothing to do with your ancestors. And all of us have had to make choices which my parents or grandparents would have frowned on. But I had to do them because circumstances forced me to make a choice. We have to make a choice. Which choice I made, of course, is my personal decision. I can't blame it on anybody else. I made the choice, and I take the consequences. And I think these are, of course, in a way, acceptance of the fact that when you're away from your STEM family in China and you're outside as an overseas Chinese, wherever you are much more individualized. You're left with a nuclear family at most, and therefore the decisions are made by a handful of people, not by your whole clan. For example, if you're in your own village, back in China and so on, you will not be allowed to make your decision. The whole clan decides for you, and you have to observe and pay respect to the fact that your clan, the head of your family, tells you, you may not do this, you may only do this. You may rebel and run away, but that's a personal problem. But that's rare, because that's the nature of the society. But when you're outside, those constraints are no longer so strong. You are essentially an individual, or at most a nuclear family with a small number of your direct kin, and you can make decisions much more easily and rapidly, and people do. And in fact, if you're living in the modern society today, almost anywhere, you are probably making decisions as individuals. You make your decision because of your professional interests, the kind of work you want to do, the kind of person you want to be. And that kind of individualism wasn't part of that heritage that our ancestors passed on to us. That was something that is much more part of the modern post-Enlightenment European set of values, which many of us have learned to appreciate, because they give us a different sense of our individuality and a different sense of our freedom of choice, and we appreciate that. And so the younger generation also have learned, depending on where they grew up and educated in, they appreciate the choices they have, and they would like to have the freedom to make those choices when the time comes. And you can transmit what you think is right, and they would accept it or not accept it according to the circumstances they face and the kind of problems that they come across. So I do feel that there's no simple answer to your question. It's a very deep and profound question that all of us are concerned about, and everybody does his best to educate the children and the grandchildren to accept the values that he himself appreciates. And that is right. That's your duty, and you should do that. And that is what cultural respect means, and you should do that. But beyond that, I don't know that you can do much. And the way the world is changing, I think this is going to be less and less easy for people to conform, except under forced circumstances. Now, this is, of course, something that's undesirable. We don't want to see a world in which you have no choice. You have to be this or not at all. And this is why, of course, I come back to this nationalism that I'm talking about today, whether in China or United States or in any other country. When that kind of nationalism narrows down your choices to say that you're either with us or you're against us, that makes life much, much more complicated. I mean, the fact that you can argue that I can pass on my values to my children and they have the choice to accept or not accept, that already presumes a relatively free society in which there is that kind of atmosphere or the legal rights and protections that enables one to make those choices. But there may be a world in which you have no choice. In a way like being part of a large family in which your head of the family or the clan elders tell you, this is what you have to do, no choice. Now this now we're talking about a country, and that is much more terrifying, much bigger, much more powerful, much bigger, and so on. And if the country has a system in which authority is absolute in the hands of a few powerful people, what choices have you got? I mean, and even if it's not, if it's the whole public, all the nationalists in the country shout in one voice, and you try to say something different, and they'll pounce on you and simply destroy you because you're not agreeing with the majority. The tyranny of the majority is another form of democracy which is very frightening. You can produce, the majority says, this is it. And if you're a minority, you conform or else. So these are some of the extreme conditions which may well happen and could happen if we allow it to happen. So if you don't want that to happen, then you have, and you live in a society when you can, then you have to do your best, whatever it is, socially, culturally, politically, economically, professionally, to do your best to create the conditions in which more people have more choices and more freedom to make those choices. Because if you don't have that, then you have the other situation in which you are simply told what to do and you have to do it.
Thank you, Professor Wang. Let me ask one of our co-sponsors to ask the next question. So Dr. Liu Yawei, he's the Senior Advisor on China at the Carter Center. Dr. Liu.
Hey, Professor Wang, really nice to see you online. I think I met you in Atlanta at the Carter Center more than 10 years ago, and again on campus of Singapore National University. I think on this particular day, it's very meaningful that Michelle Wu is just elected the mayor of Boston. That, you know, it's very inspirational and exciting for all Chinese Americans here. But my question is related to one of the three prospects you mentioned for the people in the diaspora. The number one, you know, the complete loss of Chineseness. The second, you know, made the choice to be naturalized, just like me. And the third one is, you know, yet to decide where he or she is going to go. So my question is, you know, in the Five Eyes countries, you know, particularly Australia and the United States, is the complete loss of Chinese is going to do it? You know, my concern is because of what you mentioned, the US-China rivalry, you know, even if you're completely loyal, even if you lose all your Chineseness, but just, you know, how you look, the color of your skin may have, you know, trigger people question your loyalty. Do you think this is going to change as countries like US and Australia are going to evolve, or this is not going to change at all?
Well, that is a really tough one, but let me go back to something I said earlier on, and that is, in every country, there is the dark side and the bright side, and people range across the way. In every country, there's a dark history that the good people in that country want to forget and want to set aside, but may not be allowed to forget and may not be able to set aside. And I think every country has a bit of that. Every country also has some special cases. And for that, I think in the case of the United States, one very obvious thing that they are noted for, and they themselves know it, was that they started out with slaves. And one of the things they began right at the beginning, that on the one hand, they had to fight the indigenous people. On the other hand, they employed slaves to create a kind of economy which benefited them and allowed them to prosper. Half the 13 colonies were based on slavery as an economic necessity for them. In fact, had they not had them, their economy would have been quite weak and could have easily have been destroyed. They probably would not have been able to fight for independence when they did. So to that extent, they owe it to the slaves who enabled them to build a kind of wealth and strength to fight for the independence of the 13 colonies. So these are part of their history. So the bright side of history is that in the fight for their independence, they also created a whole set of extremely sound and good and reasonable values, which came out of the Western Enlightenment, not created by Americans, but created in Europe over the period of 17th and 18th century. And that's a long history, I won't go into that. But that history provided, again, got the Europeans out of a period of darkness of the Middle Ages, when the church and all the other things that flowed from the church dominated all lives and created all kinds of limitations and constraints. And they freed themselves from it through the Renaissance and the Reformation to reach the point of the Enlightenment period, when they secularized their political life and kept the church out of political life, and to create a new set of values which secularized those values and made them just ordinary human values that they hoped and they claim to be universal. And this is their particular claim. And the Americans benefited from that. They used that to draw up their constitution. This is the bright side of the Americans. There may be flaws in the constitution, but basically what they stood for was modern, was to get away from the European feudal traditions and the aristocracy and all the kind of privilege and inequalities and unfairness in the West and fighting among themselves to free themselves in a very new country, starting with the New World, in which they now claim their exceptionalism. And I think that it's a genuine one. But behind it all, what they did not emphasize, but was there deep rooted in their society, was their slavery background, which was basically racist. It didn't start that way. They didn't think of it as racism. But where did racism come in? In the past, we always had a bit of xenophobia, people against people who are different, who look different, who are foreign. That is common to everybody. Every tribe, every family, every country had something like that. But racism is something very special. Racism really came from the scientific, biological developments of the 18th century, from experiments with animals and plants and so on, they derived the idea that some species are superior to others. And they derived the idea that a mixed breed is a mongrel, is inferior to a pure breed. All these things come from biological sciences. And with the certainty that the scientists used to talk in those terms, it crept into the social sciences. It crept into the ordinary relationship between peoples and so on. And they started to look out for people who are superior to those who are inferior. And out of that came the racism that attached to slavery. As I said, originally there were two separate problems, but they were merged together into the idea which still survives today, that some people are superior to others. And on the whole, the whites are superior to the blacks. And this is the basis of the racism that underlies a lot of American society today, and came out very obviously on the Black Lives Movement and Black Lives Matter movement and so on. Very clear. So it's still there. In other words, after 200 years after the Civil War of America, It hasn't gone away, despite the wonderful constitutional agreements and so on. But the problem hasn't gone away because it's so deeply rooted. Now, the Asians are latecomers into this business. So by the time you and others had decided to choose America, America was putting forth its best face. The positive side was the one that they cared for. And I don't doubt that the leaders, from people like Woodrow Wilson to Roosevelt, down to the present, the political leaders, wanted that to be the America. That is the America they wanted to represent to the world, and they were proud of. They were not proud of their racism and their slavery, and they wanted to put it aside and not talk about it, and so on. But it was there. It never went away. And in fact, it undergirded almost everything that was happening in the American society, that the black and white part of it all. But of course, that racism, which started out as black and white, could be extended to people of different colors, other colors. So it's only a different way of expressing it. So that was a fundamental dark side of the United States, which is peculiar to the United States because it was so institutionalized for so long. I can think of no other country that has quite that particular development. So it is an extreme case of some of the most idealistic hopes and aspirations that one country has developed when it founded itself, and at the same time, a dark history that it wanted so much to hide, but does not go away and continues to dominate their lives one way or the other, and in fact explodes every now and then, and for good reason. And even within my lifetime, this question of the black and white has exploded several times. It's not the first time, but the Black Lives Matter is just the most recent manifestation of something very deep into society, and which most Americans, at least to my knowledge, most of my American friends deplore and wish it wasn't there, wasn't true. But they cannot escape from it because that is so powerful. And that probably lies behind many of those supporters who voted for President Trump and now would want to challenge any attempt to soften that or to weaken that kind of white versus the others kind of mentality, the siege mentality that seems to be developing. So these are the negative side. Now, of course, there are still, to my mind, half the population, if not more, are still inclined to fight for the bright side of what the United States stands for, even among the whites. I think they still believe in it and they still want it to happen, but they need support. They need people to understand them. They don't need to be divided among themselves. What I find worrying is that the liberal part, the Democrats and the others who genuinely believe in the ideals of the founding fathers of the United States and so on, are finding themselves cornered by the kind of nationalistic and racist elements which are coming to the fore. And the more of this comes out in the Congress, in the political rivalries and so on, the more worrying it gets for the rest of the world, because this kind of polarization not only upsets and destroys the democratic principles in which the society had so successfully developed over the centuries, it actually destroys the very nature of relationships between people who are different in color, different in culture, different in political orientations. You polarize everything. Everything becomes yes or no. And frankly, democracy cannot survive in a society that is totally polarized. The successful democracies in the world have been always dependent on a very strong middle, in which the extremes on one side or the other are kept as minorities and set aside. And the majority of the people may divide between center left and center right, but they essentially agree on the positive side of the national values that they fight for. But that middle, which has always been the strength of the American democracy, particularly in the 20th century, since the days of Woodrow Wilson down to the until recent times, that has been narrowing over the last few decades. I can actually see that because when I first visited the United States in 1960, I could see that the world was still primarily victorious after the Second World War, having the world, as it were, looking to the United States for great values and so on. On the whole, the vast majority of the Americans seem to be in the center. Differences left and right to some extent, but definitely in the center, and projecting that image to the rest of the world. The soft power that John and I, Professor and I, Joseph and I talks about, that comes out of the central position that they represented. But where is it now? Today, I mean, you look at the United States, you look at what happens in Congress and how the politicians talk in America, you can see that it's polarized almost 50-50. And this is no good for democracy. Democracy does not work like that. Because then when it reaches that point, then your politicians appeal to what they call populism. You appeal to being popular. You say the things that people like to hear, and you find that the people like to hear things which differentiate themselves from others. You emphasize it to win their support and gain their vote and so on. And that kind of democracy ends up with a populism which could easily end up with a dictatorship. And this is, in fact, this was predicted by Aristotle in the Greek philosophers way back. This is what happens to democracy when you don't have the middle, as it were, in charge, and you polarize in that way. So this is not in itself new. The instincts, the human instincts have been there. And it's a failure of the people in the center to hold the center. So when I see the people who are liberal and are in favor of a great and the United States representing progress and modernity and so on, divided among themselves, then it really is fearful. It really is alarming. So what I think all the other people can do, who are neither whites nor blacks, in that kind of polarized society, and the racism that's coming to the surface, to try and play down that and play a role to bring out the positive side that America used to stand for, and set aside, do what you can to identify those extremes and put those extremes, whether they are left or right, put those extremes aside so that the middle can prosper.
Thank you very much. We have another person who likes to ask you a question. He is Dr. Liang Haiming from Hong Kong. Are you on, Haiming? Could
Yes,
you introduce?
yes.
Could you introduce yourself a little bit?
Okay, thank you. I am Liang Haiming, come from Hong Kong and also come from China Hainan University. Firstly, thank you, Professor Feng, for giving me this opportunity to ask questions. Good morning, Professor Wang. Thank you so much for the really enlightening presentation. I learned a lot from you. I would like to ask you two questions about how can overseas Chinese work together to promote Chinese culture, crossing all geographical and political boundaries. The second question is what the United States and Western countries are facing today. The rise of China or the rise of Asia? Thank you.
About Chinese working together, depends on what you're working on. If you're working on a kind of better appreciation of Chinese culture, preservation of values which you fundamentally believe in and believe it is good and positive for all societies, I don't think there's any doubt you can do that. You share your experiences and you learn from how other people work hard to preserve those cultural values in the generations to come. And that is something that we can learn from each other. But if you put it in political terms, I personally believe it doesn't work. Because in political terms, you are faced with the fact that you are living in different nations, and every government, every nation has its own way of doing things, and you cannot cross borders that way. If you start crossing national borders, you actually create more problems than you solve. So political solutions is not the way to go for what you call all the Chinese work together. I think the Chinese can share cultural values together, education, language, teaching of values, family, the respect for the family, for example, is central to Chinese culture. It may be different degrees of familial connections, but it's central. But when it comes to politics, it's a different matter in the nation state. Before the nation state is a different thing. Pre-modern political conditions are different. But today in the nation state, like it or not, and I used to be very uncritical of nation building. I thought it was a positive thing for all new nations to try and build their nations. I'm less positive now because I've seen what happens when people become nationalistic and become so nationalistic they lose their new sense of responsibility, new sense of reason, and become totally irrational and it could be even very cruel and totally uncaring. So that I no longer have that kind of ideal, naive belief in nation. But the reality of the nation cannot be denied. They are now more or less there. I'm not sure there's any way you can get rid of them. And in fact, the sovereignty, the idea of a sovereign nation state is so sacred today, not only to the small countries, to countries like China and United States. They talk about their sovereign states, their sovereignty as the most sacred thing ever. And the fact that these big countries talk like that, what chances of the small countries to talk otherwise? And in fact, the small countries, their only chance very often, like the Southeast Asian small country, look at these attempts at ASEAN, getting together all the 10 countries, surrender a little bit of their sovereignty so that they can work together to defend their interests against some powerful neighbors and so on. That you can see they try to do that, but each country is still very, very sensitive about its sovereignty and its national interest. They surrender a little bit only for a specific goal, but no more. So in that context, for China to Chinese around to talk about Chinese in every country coming together to solve problems, I think it's just not the way to go. It will actually create more problems.
Okay, thank you, Professor Wang. Let me ask another participant to ask a question. May I ask the Professor Rui Liang, the president of the North American Hakka Association, to ask his question?
Okay.
Ray, would you unmute yourself?
Okay, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Thanks, Professor Pei. Give me an opportunity to ask a question. Okay, this is Ray Liang in US. I serve as the president of North American Hakka Association and operate International Institute for Hakka Studies. Thanks, Professor Wang, for great sharing tonight. My question is, it was well known you are the co-founder and serve the first president for International Society for Overseas Chinese Studies. And almost at the same time when your society was founded, in 1992, International Society for Archaeology was also founded in Hong Kong Chinese University, 香港中文大学. At the inauguration conference, you made a keynote speech, which was very well known, and we still have that speech note. However, after Singapore meeting in 1996, that Society for Archaeology did not organize any more meetings, even eventually disappeared. It's my belief Professor Wang was part of the history, likely part of the history. So my question is, I would like to know more about the how this Society of Archaeology was created, and then after 4 years, how did it disappear? Thank you.
I don't know that it is all relevant to what we're doing today. Those are special cases of people who are attempting to inspire interest in different subjects, and there are different reasons why some things succeed and some things don't. So I can't specifically explain that one. All I can say is that if you find that the institute, the conference that we organized about the study of overseas Chinese, Chinese overseas, ISCO, that has continued. And I think the reason for that is because we were quite modest in what we were doing. We were concerned with sharing the study of the Chinese overseas. We did not have a political position. We did not maintain any particular stand, which everybody must agree to. We all asked that we pay attention to, and all of us make every effort to study this problem so that we can understand the issues better and share our views around. So the search of knowledge was the central point to that international association that we set, international society that we set up at the time. And I think that has been the secret of its success, that everybody who's interested finds their own way of studying it, because their own countries are different, their own societies are different, the questions that interest them are different. But the point is that we can all get together, and when we share our views, share our different experiences and the research that we have done, and why they are different and why some things are similar and so on, we learn from one another to the point when we all appreciate that this is positive. This is something that we can all learn from. So I believe that there are different kinds of societies so for different purposes, and each one has a different mission. And if your mission is very clear, you can avoid a lot of problems. If it's not so clear, it can create problems. So these are things we learn all the time. We were, I think, fortunate in defining our studies and our interest in Chinese overseas as being something that everybody wanted to know. So as a result of which, we could go on as long as we have done, over 20 years now, and it's still going on. So I think this does tell me something, and maybe this is relevant to our future. It comes back to this question of cultural sharing, because I mean, it's not political, and it is a question of sharing cultural values. I think most people can understand that. They don't feel threatened by it. It's something that you share, and if you believe in it, it works. It has nothing to do with the state. Now, this is where the question becomes sensitive. Is it something that comes out of your desire as a citizen, as a scholar, as a professional, in one way or the other? You're just interested and you want to know. You want to make sure that all of us who share this idea that we would love our children to be Chinese and feel proud to be Chinese, and our grandchildren to go on feeling that they are proud to say, I'm of Chinese descent and I'm proud of it. If we all share this, and it has no political intent, but something that we just feel that these are, it's almost like a religion or like a faith. It's something that you personally believe in. That is perfectly legitimate. But once you politicize it, once you say the state, whichever state says, you should do this, all Chinese must do this, all Chinese should go out and do this and do this and do that. And the state, a government comes and gives you money to do that, asks you to do that all the time, extols you to do that. You must do, if you're a good Chinese, you must do that everywhere. And so then it changes the whole tone of the whole thing. That is no longer a cultural enterprise. It becomes a political enterprise, a kind of an enterprise that's led by a government with different ideals at the back of their minds. So these are things which every one of us, I think, should be clear about. Are we doing it because we really care for the cultural values? Or are we doing it because some government or other tells us we must do it, or we should do it? We must all get together. All Chinese must unite against the enemy. That sort of language makes a situation, to my mind, it makes a situation much more complicated and much, much more dangerous for the people concerned.
Yeah, I just want to make, what I'm referring to is a 客家人呀，国际客家学协会，香港中文大学1992年成立国际客家学会。Thank you.
Well, as you know, each group has it. It's not only the Keja people; they happen to be more dynamic than others. But the Shaodo people do it, the Cantonese do it. In fact, the Cantonese have different groups doing it. You know, and the Seya people and the Sundak people, different groups do it differently, and so everybody does it to some extent, and that's perfectly all right, because what you are seeking for common cultural traits and so on. But you don't have a political agenda. You are not up against any particular state or for a particular state. You're not working for some political purpose, which other political units will not allow you or will not agree to. And then you don't threaten other people. You're doing it just for your educational, social, cultural purpose, transmission of certain values which you believe in and you would like to see transmitted. If you believe in it, then I think you should do it. You should have the right to do it.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Professor Wang, you mentioned say yup. It's actually yup now.
Oh yeah, yup now, sorry.
Because my hometown, Hokshan, is added into it to become yup. So I'm very sensitive about 4 to 5. Anyway, the next person I'd like to invite to ask a question is Mr. Aaron Lan. Are you on, Mr. Aaron Lan? Mr. Aaron Lan? Hello?
Yeah. Okay.
Okay, go ahead. Ask your question.
Can you see me?
Oh, good. Go ahead.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for giving me the opportunity.
Also, tell people who you are.
Okay. I'm Aaron Lan from Florida State University. I do have 2 questions, and both questions are about the term Chinese diaspora. The first question is for Professor Wang. Professor Wang was one of the first scholars to use that term Chinese diaspora many, many years ago. Someone just reminded me it's back to 1992. That's almost 30 years now. But then later on, we know in a couple of places, the articles, Professor Wang seemed to have abandoned that term, and Professor Wang replaced that term with another term, Chinese overseas, which I don't see any different from overseas Chinese. Anyway, so many scholars followed, especially after Chinese diaspora study came to be brutally attacked by Sinophone study critics. So I'm curious how Professor Wang comment on the term, which is being used today for the title of the meeting. My second question is about the same thing, but this question is for our meeting organizer, maybe Professor Feng or Professor Pei, either one of you will be fine. So my second question is regarding the conference title, Chinese Diaspora in the Modern World. I'm curious whether or not we can interpret such a naming, by calling the Chinese, overseas Chinese, the enlarged group, as Chinese diaspora. Can we interpret this as a gesture, as a sign of reclaiming the Chinese diaspora?
Thank you for the question. I'm sorry you got it all wrong. I never used the word Chinese diaspora. I was not.
Oh, no, I saw it in your essay.
No, I'm sorry, you must have got the dates wrong. I never used it. In fact, I objected to it right from the beginning. I only managed to accept it because my colleagues in the social sciences, particularly the sociologists, they had adopted it for everybody. You know, the Arab diaspora, the German, the Irish diaspora, they use it and so on. Why are you objecting to it being used for the Chinese? I totally objected to it because I'm not talking about just the Chinese overseas. Diaspora has a particular meaning in my mind. It comes from the original Greek use, which was used, in fact, which applied very well to the Jews. And the Jews used it. And in the English language, if you look up the Oxford English Dictionary, which traces the etymology of every word in the English language, they would trace the word diaspora to application to the Jews. They applied it to the Jews. And what they mean was the people who lost their homes, who long for their homes, and they've developed their whole society for thousands of years, wanting to go home to their original home of Israel. Now that does not apply to the Chinese, and is a word which I think should not be applied to everybody. Not everybody, just because you're a migrant and you're going to settle somewhere else, you're not a diaspora. You're nothing like the Jewish diaspora. So the way the social scientists universalized that term to apply to everybody was what I objected to. And I objected to that for many, many years. But in the end, I let it go because I had my reservations. I placed on record my objection to the term. I had allowed it to be used, and I don't now bother to object to it. Of course, you're right to say when I talk about the Chinese overseas, it also covers all the Chinese, but it doesn't have the connotation of all wanting to go back to China to do something to China. I mean, the Jews wanted to go back to restore the state of Israel. There was no need for the Chinese to do that. China was perfectly fine without them. Whether they go home or not, China would be there. China is much greater than any Chinese overseas. And the Chinese overseas are not relevant to the future of China. China is going to be there no matter what. So there's no comparison. So that's why I still object to the being used. But since the social sciences have used it so commonly, I mean, no point in my just objecting all the time. I use it only in that sense. In fact, Professor Pei knows that I have reservations about that. I didn't bother to object to the term now, but when I used the Chinese overseas, the reason was a very specific one and limit to a particular time. This was to object to the term Huaqiao, which was translated as overseas Chinese. And I objected to that, not objected to, I wanted to define that very clearly. Huaqiao means you are temporarily living abroad. And once you have settled and become a citizen of another country, you are not a Huaqiao. So that is why I thought when it was used, for example, in America for the Lao Huaqiao, but I noticed that almost all the Lao Huaqiao were United States citizens. Right. They're not Huaqiao. They're not temporarily living in the United States. They are United States citizens. So I think the Huaqiao is wrong to use Huaqiao. And Huaqiao was translated as overseas Chinese. So what I tried to do was to remove the connotation from Huaqiao to use the word, to take a more general term, Huaren, and turn the way Chinese overseas instead of overseas Chinese, just to escape from the Huaqiao connotation that Chinese are people who are only temporarily resident abroad. In other words, they are simply sojourners, temporary. They will owe no loyalty to anybody else except to China. That's the implication of Huaqiao. And I don't believe that is true. Even when I was a young boy, I already knew most of my friends, Chinese in Malaya and Singapore and so elsewhere, are settled there for generations and no intention of going back to China. They have nobody, they have no connection. They don't even know exactly where they come from in China, but they are very proud of being Chinese. And this is the interesting part. You can be very proud of Chinese without wanting to go back to China or having anything to do with the country called China. You can be very, and this is the cultural part of it. You are proud of being Chinese and you're able to transmit that. And this is, people forget that this so-called, I call them native Chinese, the Peranakan, the Baba in Malaysia, the native Chinese, and they, under circumstances which are very special, I agree, but nevertheless, generations of them, they remain Chinese and very proud of it without being able to speak Chinese, without knowing anything about China or even ever thinking of going back to China. But they were proud of being Chinese. That's something that I would say that is another way of looking at it, which is quite different, the very opposite of the diaspora, I would say.
Wow,
Oh, thank
you,
you.
Aaron. Thank you for raising this question.
Yep.
I think.
Can I follow up on that?
No,
Aaron?
I think we have to go on now. Thank you.
Okay,
All right, thanks.
Aaron, let me just respond to your second part of the question. I think you may be late for the meeting because at the opening statement, I did comment on that the Professor Wang was really object to the term used, the diasporas. The reason we raised that question, we actually have email exchange with Professor Wang on that one, because that is kind of tradition in the Chinese government. Both the nationalist and the communist government has the officer. In translation, it's called overseas Chinese or something like that. But in turn, they really mean 侨办, or in Taiwan called 侨委会. So they really mean, they call it overseas Chinese, they really mean diasporas. So as I said at the opening, that really is part of the problem we Chinese American are facing today in the US. That really create a question of the due loyalty and all those ambiguity issues. But let's move on. I think Matt Lu, I think you have a question. Are you ready to ask the question?
Yes, thank you. Thank you for giving me the opportunity. Hi, Professor Wang. My name is Max. I'm probably least qualified to ask a lot of questions, but because I'm still, I think, early in my career and still exploring. But just to give you a bit context about myself so you can understand where my question comes from. I was born and raised in China for my first 18 years. And then I came to Canada to study and spent almost 10 years there. And I now work for a US company. I initially studied engineering, but later pivoted to media because I felt like, there's such a big cultural gap between where I came from and where I'm living now. So I kind of felt like, hey, popular media is the best place for you to get in touch with all those. So I worked at the Los Angeles Times, and now I'm working at media company. So my question is, I think for many people in my generation, including myself, what we're seeing is we as a species are facing many challenging problems, from climate to health to this and that. And as much as I'm super proud of being Chinese, which is what you said as the culture part, honestly, I care less about the nationality part. I feel like I have a lot of options. I can go back to China, I can stay in Canada, I can go to the US, but I really don't care. It's more of a practical decision. Which one offers me a better tax rate and give me a better education for my offspring, right? So the question is, to me and to many people I know like me, we care so much less about the whole question about nationality, but then there is such a rising focus on the idea of nation. But in the meantime, you also setting out the discussions. The idea of nation itself is quite a new thing in the course of our history. How do you see the evolving role and meaning of nation interplay with the vision of global citizen, which is kind of an aspiration that I live up to, but I'm finding it very hard because, when you're talking about nations, it almost feels like a dividing force. You have to belong to this clan or the other one, but then global citizens all will stay in the middle, like looking for common grounds, which is becoming very rare.
That's a very good question. It's a question of very much a 21st century question. But I think those of us in my generation, we grew up actually believing that globalization was a positive thing that will make the world a happier place, when people will stop thinking of differences and concentrate much more on what we have in common, and we're together. And we talked about humanity, mankind, humanitarian things which we all share, universal values which we all share. All these terms were very much on everybody's mind and something to hope for. So what you are still hoping for is something that I fully understand, and I appreciate that. To be quite frank, that is not new. We did actually want it all along. The nation thing, however, which is new, is of course, it's something that you can actually play down. It's a matter of decision. Whether your government plays down nationalism is entirely possible. But if your government decides to play up nationalism, encourages its people and encourages everything to be formulated in nationalist terms, then the problem becomes serious. And one of the reasons for this, of course, was the fact that people are less confident about globalization. So what you describe is something that I would say was very normal. It's something that I grew up in too, that what we have in common is, say, for example, the same professional interests, the same interest in UK, climate change, whatever, pandemic, something that's common to all humanity. That's part of the globalization mentality that we grew up with. But what has happened is that globalization also meant that the rich got very rich and the poor, while some were doing better, the middle class began to suffer. And most of all in the United States. So you are actually in the country, in that part of the world, in North America, where the middle class has perceived itself as having suffered most from globalization. When all the industries of America went out of America to the places where the labor was cheap, that is part of globalization. They see that as part of globalization. They see the negative part of it is that they lost their jobs, their whole industries disappeared, the prospect of their children being better off than they are has diminished. Unlike in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, the baby boomers generation, which believed very confidently that their children will be better off than they will be. And that is a great thing. And we in Asia still believe in that because we still think that is still possible. But if you look at Western Europe and North America today, more and more people in the middle class are no longer confident that their children will be better off than they were. And once you lose that, in the middle class loses that confidence, in fact, that is where the whole of the capitalist world has based its future on, that it builds a strong middle class, and the middle class will always be moderate, and they will hold the center, keeping out the extremists. It's the middle class with their interests and so on. They will work together, and why democracy will work. That's why they hope that if everybody developed a middle class, they become democratic like the Americans. There's some reason, but it's not entirely illogical. It follows from their own experience. But what has happened is that globalization, instead of making that, the middle class is growing in Asia, in Africa, and elsewhere, even in Latin America, but it's not growing in Western Europe and North America. On the contrary, it is actually shrinking in some parts of the United States and Canada, for all I know. But that fact has changed a lot of people's minds about globalization. That globalization actually threatens your national interest. It doesn't help you, it actually makes you poorer. Now, once you get that into your mind and you turn against globalization, then all the ideals that you spoke of becomes a bit more difficult to sell, because then you talk about common problems and so on, which fellow professionals, fellow scientists, fellow engineers, and so on should be coming together, working together to solve humanity's problems, become now suspect. That when you come together, will you share your knowledge? I mean, what you learn, you got to share it with somebody who might potentially be your enemy, and so on. So you have national security interests. You want to block knowledge. You don't want to share knowledge. You want to say knowledge is for ourselves, only for our good. We shouldn't allow the others to get our knowledge. Just the opposite of globalization. So that has happened only in the last decade or so. Really happened. I mean, people blame it on Trump. I don't think it is Trump. Trump actually just built on it. It was already happening, I would say, probably the beginning of the 21st century. And by 2008, with the financial crisis in the United States, it exposed the fact that the Americans were not getting better off. At least the middle class felt they were not getting better off. And the kind of polarization began to appear when the middle class itself got divided into such sharp divides. And as a result of which, now what you talk about, it doesn't seem to be an idealistic problem, it becomes somewhat naive. It does not take into account national security interests, doesn't account for America first or China first. So you bring up nationalism as a defense mechanism to use this as an instrument to destroy the enemy or to contain the enemy, to make sure that your rivals and your competitors can't be better off. So that kind of mentality has now crept in and it's become very strong. And that is what you're facing now, is something very, in a way, very peculiar to the people's response to the globalization that has been a bit too successful. And unfortunately, it is true. In the course of globalization, the rich, the really rich, have become obscenely rich, and the poor are not getting that better off. And the middle class, apart from certain parts of Asia and Africa and so on, the middle class feel that they are actually being threatened. Now, that atmosphere is very antagonistic towards any kind of broad professional thinking that you have in mind. I mean, I read a lot about what they call racial profiling among the scientists in the United States and so on. Well, that is part and parcel of it. It's not just racial alone. It's to do with this question of, are you sharing knowledge with potential challenger, a potential rival and competitor and potential enemy? So then once you draw those lines, then the global citizen part is considered to be suspect and naive. And I regret that very much, but I can see at the moment anyway, for the next decade or so, next few years or so, I don't see any way of recover from that position. I think it needs a lot of people with the will to, and the real idealism still left to fight back against this trend. And it's not an easy battle.
Well,
thank you, Professor Wang. I think that we are 10 minutes over time, so we don't want to abuse our privilege. I think, let me try to summarize some of the discussion we have today. I think if I hear you correctly, it's very clearly every one of us as an individual, we have a decision to make. And so are our children and our grandchildren. I think as what Yahweh mentioned earlier when he made a comment, today, I think the Chinese American made history. Michelle Wu won the election in Boston. The very first Chinese lady win the mayor of the major city. So I think one question along the direction you just talked about racial profiling, people are asking the question, Chinese American, not as an individual, as a collective, what can we do to bridge the middle in American society? We know it's polarizing. And I think extreme left and extreme right, either one is that healthy to Chinese Americans. And the other question raised by many of the participants here is also not just between how can we bridge the middle ground in the US, but also bridge the China and the US. Is that really an overstretch that Chinese Americans should do?
Are you still asking a question? Or
Yes, I'm asking a question. And maybe I can turn you over to Darshan. When you make the summary remark, you can say a few words if you like.
Well,
Darshan?
first of all, first of all, well, perhaps Professor Wang would like to respond to what has just been said by Professor Pei.
Let me be very brief about the thing. The most, I think, very significant example that comes up is this question of racial profiling of the scientists, because this was one of the most advanced areas of global cooperation, determined by scientific knowledge, by the search, the quest for knowledge, that in the quest of knowledge, we should make no differentiation about your ethnic origins or your national origins. This is the job of your profession as a scientist and engineer. And it applies to all professions, maybe medical, academic, other professions, and so on. As a professional commitment to your profession, you have certain duties and certain things you should try to do. And you should do that and forget about ethnic and national distinctions, and you do it because of what you believe in. That is your professional duty. I think that to my mind, that's fairly clear. And objecting to racial profiling on those terms is perfectly good, perfectly sound. The real difficulty is that when it comes to the Chinese in America, I started at the beginning by saying there are a lot of varieties of Chinese and many layers of Chinese. And the thing is that not all Chinese think alike. Not all Chinese are agreed about where they stand vis-a-vis their profession, or whether they're still loyal to their countries or to their respective countries or their ancestral country, or to their other connections outside of the profession. There are also other connections. Every individual, as we all know, every one of us have multiple identities. Which identity you want to use at any one time. If you're using your professional identity, that's one thing. But you have other identities and other loyalties, which you don't normally display, and that's another thing. So unfortunately, in the United States today, all the layers of the Chinese are all present in significant numbers, not so much in my area in Southeast Asia, but in the United States, the layers are very, very clear. The layers of those who came when the gold rush, the layers who were left behind in the early 20th century, the layers that came after the 1949 failure of the nationalists, the layers that came after the rise of Deng Xiaoping in the 1980s, and now the layers to do with the rise of China. All these layers provided different kinds of Chinese, and they're not all one, and you can't expect them to think alike or to behave alike or to make the same decisions. So how do you differentiate even among yourselves? So I don't understand the principles of the criteria used by the FBI or the American government. That's their problem. But the point is that from an outsider, from a non-Chinese, any non-Chinese, looking at the fact that there's so many varieties of Chinese, how would they know which group of Chinese you really belong to? Are you the layer which would settle and whose loyalty is not in question, all the way down to those who recent arrivals, who are professionally engaged and valuable and making contributions, but who have other loyalties and other motivations which we may not know about. So from the outside, looking at the very complex, many varieties and layers of Chinese in the United States, I can see that the outsider is puzzled. I mean, even as Chinese, we don't always know. So when non-Chinese are afraid of the rise of China and think that China is a future threat and so on, they look around and say, my goodness, all these millions of Chinese, if they get together, what happens in the United States? And of course, when people get very irrational about this, it gets really fearful, then that is the dangerous part. So the Chinese themselves within the United States must also make every effort to demonstrate that they're either doing for professional reasons, for cultural reasons, or if they have political motives, make it obvious their political position. Nothing to hide. Make it obvious that I have a political position, my loyalty is such and such, but I'm a professional. And as a professional, I still do the following things, but you know that my loyalties are somewhere else. And then, of course, you divide very clearly. Certain things you may not do because you're not really one of us. You can't do this. And that makes the host country also more sort of relaxed about it. But at the moment, because your 5 million or so people of Chinese descent in America are so many different groups and different types, you can't generalize about all of them. So then all these outsiders want to find ways and means of differentiating, and they're using racial profiling, they're using all kinds of other ways of finding out, which are invading your privacy, challenging your rights here and there, and making terrible mistakes every now and then, totally unfair. All these things can happen under those circumstances. So there's no easy way except to be totally transparent about where you are. Your first loyalty is to your profession, your first loyalty is to the United States, or your first loyalty is to China, or your first loyalty is to your family, and you're not political at all. All these differentiations vary from person to person, and there's no one single answer. The moment you're transparent about that, you actually make the other side a little more relaxed. But when they don't know, and very often fear comes out of ignorance, out of misunderstanding, out of failure to understand. And then when they don't know, they're suspicious. And suspicion grows into, all kinds of fears, and they start to introduce measures which are totally irrational and actually self-defeating in many ways. So unfortunately, that is the reality, a very messy reality that we all have to face.
Thank you.
May I say a few words?
Yeah, well, I'm after that, what more to say? But I think Professor Wang has clearly demonstrated that he is a walking treasure.
He is for sure.
And I want to thank him so much for spending almost almost 2 hours now.
Almost 2 hours now. We should not overextend our
And we should not extend our privilege. I also want to thank Professor Wang for he is now saying 91 birthday. Happy birthday to him. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Professor Wang.
Thank you.
Good night. Oh, good morning.
Good morning. Well, Professor Wang, I think if you are interested, let me say a few words, tell you what's going on with the China Initiative. I think we initial effort to write to President Biden before at the beginning of January. And also in the process, we helped organize the first congressional roundtable chaired by both Representative Jamie Raskin. As you know, he is also one chairing the January 6th committee, and also Judy Chu. She is the chair of the KPAC. It stands for Congressional Asian Pacific American Caucus, 亚太党团. So that congressional roundtable was chaired by both of them. And just last Friday, the KPAC leadership met with Department of Justice Attorney General Garland And one of the topic on the top of agenda was the China Initiative. So I think, and it just happened the day before on Thursday, Matt Olson was confirmed by the Senate to be the Assistant Attorney General in charge of this area. So his mission is really to review the whole China Initiative.
Oh, congratulations.
So things are moving. I think since the beginning of 2018, the 14 organization led by Committee of 100 wrote to FBI Director Christopher Wray on March 1st, 2018, to now finally at the first meeting with the Attorney General, had the first congressional roundtable. We came a long way. But to some degree, that's what we are doing together collectively as a Chinese American.
Well, I really appreciate what you're telling me about this. I think that's really the right way to go. And it is something that deserves success and deserves to be carefully considered by those who are in a position to make a difference.
Thank you, everyone.
Very much.
Thank you very much, everyone, for joining us.
Thank you.
The discussion has been most abundant, but we have slightly overrun our time. So we thank all of you in the audience for staying with us up to now, and also for all of you who have sent in questions. And of course, I'm sure you'll join me in thanking our speaker, Professor Wang. I'm sure all of us have learned a great deal today, as well as for our co-moderators, Professor Feng and Professor Pei, for the most informative dialogue. So please be welcome to submit papers to our China and the World Journal, which touches on themes that we have talked about today. And information can be found both on the screen and in the chat. So again, thank you very much to all of you for joining us today. We look forward to seeing you at future events. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you,
Bye-bye.
Professor Wang. Bye-bye.
Thank
Thank
you.
you. Well done. Well done.